NTV Television Network presents. Hello, welcome to episode 40 of The Other Day Current Era, where we'll be covering the year 2000, Milošević folds, the Kursk submarine incident, the Queen's Mother's centennial, detective novels by Akunin, mushroom poisoning in Voronezh, the Concorde crash Putin's first year, 11th place in the Hockey World Championship, Alsu and Zemfira gain nationwide recognition,
Central Committee member, Foreign Affairs Minister Raoul Leroy and other officials.
Box office ratings, VHS sales, soundtrack charts were topped by Alexei Balabanov's Brother 2. This was the sequel to a film simply called Brother, and it conveyed a much more straightforward and clear message in terms of what the creators were trying to portray and get across to the viewer. Finally, a protagonist from a modern Russian movie who gained the status of a national hero. America is circling the drain, you know? The drug-fueled phrase from the first movie was turned into an epigraph for the entire sequel. Sergei Bodorov's Danila Bagrov was a small-town guy who fought in Chechnya and came to help his older brother, played by Viktor Sukharukov. He was fighting for the truth, first in St. P and then in Moscow. Then the brothers made it across the pond to finish off all evil in the world and to discover the national dream. I learned that I have a big family. The trail going through the forest, every flower in the field, the river, the blue sky. All of that from birth is mine. That is my country of birth. I love everyone on earth. The old mythical 1980s America was now a parody to Danila, while the old 1980s farce that was patriotism was now the new myth. New times, new directors, but the Russian action movie ethos remained. It was all in the name of a grand idea as opposed to just shooting things up. The American bad guy who spoke absolutely no Russian while cornered heard a variation of Alexander Nevsky's phrase uttered right before the battle on the ice. What is power? Is it money? My brother also thinks so. I think that power is in truth. If it's on your side, you win. The path of a true Russian, when truth is above the law.
Are you all gangsters?
Вы гангстеры?
No, we are Russians.
Нет, мы русские.
America was paid visit by the great patriotic truth, with murders in the toilet, and revenge for the desecration of the holy. You bastards are gonna pay for Sevastopol. Don't shoot. Brother 2, a film shot in Hollywood fashion, was a major box office success, as well as a fantastic response to Western blockbusters with Russians as the bad guys. Committees were once again discussing creator liability, the filmmakers' response being that the youth won't take anything literally, and they were really squeezing everything they could out of the popular franchise. The two brother films were followed by a making-of tape, and after the official soundtrack, they released an album with songs that could have been featured in the film. Then there was the computer game Back to America. In August of 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church's Council of Bishops set an all-time record in the number of saints they canonized, at 1,154. Among them were the last Russian Emperor Nikolai II and members of his family, his wife, heir, and 4 daughters. Nikolai was worshipped as a passion-bearer, a victim who didn't resist his oppressors, the latter primarily being the Soviet government that inflicted suffering upon 860 of the new saints. Being aware of the Church's cooperation with the Soviets, the Council banned clergymen from engaging in politics, as well as intelligence and counterintelligence operations. The relationship with the current government was formal, with the Council supporting further return of property while requesting preferential tax rates for church businesses. The Church criticized freedom of religion, securing the right to call for civil disobedience. The social program that condemned abortions, homosexuality, and cloning was passed with no objection. The Church hailed the government's decision to abolish the death penalty, though it wasn't necessarily advocating for it. On June 7, 2000, the United States Court of Appeals ruled in favor of breaking up Microsoft, the world's largest corporation. The richest man in the world, businessman of the century, and a pioneer of the new global economy, Bill Gates, was charged with violating classic antitrust law adopted back in 1991. In one day, Microsoft's market capitalization saw an $80 billion decrease, while Gates himself lost $9.5 billion.
We're talking about making the computer...
They were leading the worldwide computer revolution, with 90% of the world's computers running on Bill Gates' software. According to American law, a monopoly wasn't a crime in itself, but using it to gain an edge over the competition, not so much. Microsoft began selling its famous Windows operating system bundled together with an internet browser, and that could have potentially led to stagnation in a new segment of the market. The herald of a bright future, Bill Gates, turned out to be a typical capitalist shark who was forcing people into buying what he was selling. However, his Soviet trade tactics were promptly shut down. Now the programs were to be made by two separate companies, who were banned from collaborating for 10 years, and who every 3 months were to be checked on. Justice was served. Judge Thomas Penfield Jackson, who nobody knew prior, issued a historic verdict. Here to the consumer continuing to be right going into the third millennium.
Leonid Brezhnev bestows a Gold Star medal upon Todor Zhivkov.
To the phrase, "they're eating our lard," traditionally thrown at Russians accusing them of destroying the Ukraine's primary national asset, a non-symmetrical response came about in the year 2000. They're stealing our gas. Russian natural gas was flowing westward via a pipeline that went through Ukrainian territory, and leakages amounted to about 150 million cubic meters a day. Europe's largest country was living off of stolen gas, which was even admitted by the president, who sugar-coated it by calling it unauthorized extraction. We have no idea how the gas is being extracted or where it's going. The official recipients in Europe were not pleased to be cheated, and were bewildered by the conflict between two neighboring countries. It was a beggar stealing from a poor man. According to Russian estimates, Ukraine owed about $2.2 billion, accounting for officially supplied gas, penalties for late payment, and whatever was stolen. The Ukraine was willing to settle at $1.5 billion, though they didn't have the money anyway. All year there were talks about routing a pipeline bypassing the Ukraine, about Russia acquiring the Ukrainian pipeline, or a stake in big local companies. At the end of the most dangerous century in human history, for the first time ever, a person of the most dangerous royal profession celebrated her centennial. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, grandmother to all of the people of Britain, who was in good health, turned 100 on August 4th, 2000. She was the 9th child of the 14th Earl of Strathmore and the wife of King George VI. She was born in Victorian times, and starting in 1937, she became the Queen of England for 15 years. During World War II, she demonstrated English stoicism and utter contempt for the enemy. In 1940, when Britain was fighting Hitler alone, Buckingham Palace was hit by 6 bombs simultaneously. Nevertheless, her response to Churchill suggesting to evacuate to America was, "The kids aren't leaving without me, I'll stand by the king, and His Majesty is not going anywhere." The nation's mother visited areas that were bombed, military bases, factories. Also, she put together food and medicine shipments for Stalingrad. She lost her husband in 1952. She was succeeded by her oldest daughter, also named Elizabeth, and to avoid confusion, they came up with a special title, Her Majesty the Queen Mother. Who knew that now would come her time to shine? When a time of peace was more difficult for the House of Windsor than one of war, as if frozen in time by her favorite gin looking the same as 20 years ago. She was a horse race fan with her own stable, an amazing garden with all sorts of fragrant peas, and the best Fabergé collection, always wearing an impeccable hat, and 3 really expensive pearl necklaces. She was the main keeper of tradition, and an embodiment of old Britain amidst never-ending controversy surrounding the royal family. She was the century's peer, who witnessed the fall of the quintessential everlasting dynasties. Suffice to say she was married to Nikolai II's nephew. Queen Mother Elizabeth was the best case for a monarchy that reigned but did not rule. One of the most horrendous plane crashes in history. On July 5, 2000, at 4:45 p.m. CET, a supersonic Concorde aircraft fell onto the Paris suburb Gonesse. This vessel was the most expensive, the fastest, and formerly the safest out there. This Concorde was serving flight number 4590 from Paris to New York. It was already on fire when taking off from the Charles de Gaulle airport. There was nothing the experienced Captain Christian Marty could do. Once the plane began to accelerate, the fire got completely out of control. Marty said to air control that he'll try to turn the plane around and divert to the neighboring Le Bourget airport. But in a few seconds, the burning craft exploded, crashing into the Hotelissimo hotel restaurant. 133 people were killed, including crew, passengers, and restaurant guests. The world's initial reaction was to the effect of humankind has pushed things too far with supersonic speed. It felt as if the very notion of supersonic travel died right here. Once everybody calmed down, the experts began to substantiate the contrary, their main argument being that this was the first crash in the 30 years the Concorde had been in service. Plane crashes usually don't really affect passenger turnover, with the number of people flying increasing from year to year. But that's only when the tragic statistics apply to aviation in general. Here we're talking a specific type of aircraft. Some were actually right to think that a second crash would spell the end for the Concorde. And as a matter of fact, that did happen. Just a few miles away from here in the summer of 1973, a Tu-144, the so-called Soviet Concorde, crashed, while taking off from the same Le Bourget airport that this plane didn't make it to. Soon after, a similar craft fell from the sky en route from Almaty to Moscow, which marked the end for Soviet supersonic aviation. Concordes continued to fly 2 routes, from London to New York and back, and from Paris to New York and back. Either way, it was a 3-hour flight. Their cruising speed is a whopping 1,200 plus miles an hour. That requires gigantic fuel tanks, with these planes consuming 26 gallons of kerosene per minute. The fuel from the crashed Concorde decimated everything in close proximity. Tickets were expensive, at up to $7,000, but then the Concorde was a lifesaver for very busy folks who made a lot of money on both sides of the Atlantic at once. In the year 2000, Russian media was raving about Baskov. The young, handsome tenor with the bassy last name helped the international trend of that decade, which was popular opera singing, gain traction in Russia. All it took was 1 season for 24-year-old Bolshoi theater intern Nikolai Baskov to become a major star. Scalpers were selling tickets for $100. Some papers wrote about his crystal voice and divine good looks. Others that he was an exemplary and even classic representation of the provincial flaws of Russian singing. His agency Music Perfection Beauty, all words starting with capital letters, was promoting him in true showbiz fashion. A single, an album, airtime on radio stations, a solo concert in the Kremlin, and an Ovation Award. Baskov's first TV appearances were in music videos. After becoming famous as an opera singer who performed at pop music venues, Baskov went on to sing with Montserrat Caballé in the Sports Palace, and even in Boris Pokrovsky's rendition of Onegin made for the Bolshoi. There was some negative press, something about Leonardo DiCaprio playing Lenski. But Baskov's fangirls and their enthusiasm eclipsed any legendary wild antics of the past. What began in 1999 as an anti-terrorist operation grew into full-blown warfare in 2000. It was even officially being referred to as the Second War. The Russian army swiftly moved deep into Chechen territory, which helped Vladimir Putin secure sky-high approval ratings in the rest of Russia. There were even talks about a plan to complete the operation by March 26th, the day of the presidential election. But the resistance was ferocious. It took a siege, artillery fire, intense airstrikes, and a good 2 months' time to take Grozny. Meanwhile, the info war created a rift between us and them. Radio Freedom correspondent Andrei Babitsky was first arrested for collaborating with the Chechens. Then, supposedly by his own request, the government exchanged him for 3 captive soldiers. And later, Babitsky was arrested once again in Makhachkala with a fake passport. Parallel to this convoluted story, you had high-ranking defense ministry officials explaining how you're supposed to love the motherland. We'll do what we can to provide assistance in saving the life of this lost lamb. For the first time in post-Soviet years, there was once again a right and wrong way to cover the government's actions. By March, it became clear that this wouldn't be a blitzkrieg. There was a battle with Katab's unit in the Argun Gorge, the Chechens ambushed a SWAT team convoy, Komsomolskaya was occupied by Gilayev and his troops, and beyond the capture of Salman Raduyev, who didn't look all that imposing without the beard, and Basayev getting injured and having his foot amputated, the top Chechen commandos were still at large and beyond reach. Declaring the operation officially over resulted in this becoming the typical guerrilla war. The newly appointed local administrative heads were at odds with each other, and Russia had zero control over the mountainous regions, where president of the independent Ichkeria Aslan Maskhadov was hiding. Establishing peace would take many years, even according to the military. Vladimir Kramnik became the first man to beat Garry Kasparov at chess, with a score of 8.5 to 6.5. Their match in London was for the chess crown, which made Kramnik the 14th champion of the world. However, there was a certain degree of uncertainty. First of all, rankings were more important than they were before, and Kasparov, with his multiple tournament wins, had the upper hand here. Then there was the title of FIDE World Champion, that was in contention every year. Also, after falling out with FIDE president Ilyum Zhinov, Anatoly Karpov wasn't defending his title. There seemed to be a tennis scenario unfolding, where the top 5 were all the best, and the public admired stars as opposed to a single champion. But the London match went well. Kramnik's opening preparation surpassed that of his opponent. Kasparov was fighting like a beast, even seeming to have the upper hand a few times. But then he'd make a mistake or Kramnik's defense would be too good, and as a result, Kasparov didn't win a single game. On August 8, 2000, at 5:55 p.m., a bomb went off in the underground crosswalk next to Pushkinskaya Square in Moscow. 7 people were killed on the spot, another 6 died in hospitals within a month. Over 120 were injured. As always, no one claimed responsibility for the attack. It all happened under Moscow's unofficial city center. It's where Moscow's main street, the Tverskaya, crosses with the boulevard ring. You have 3 subway stations, 2 movie theaters, a bunch of shops. This was one of the most crowded spots in the entire city. Kiosks on 2 sides of the crossing made it rather narrow. The explosives were placed inside a handbag, which was even noticed by security. Following the explosion, a wall of fire. Those were the sprays from the kiosks burning. Where's the police? What was that noise? Somebody call an ambulance. Investigators were considering several versions. That it could have been about money or politics, but during that time in Russia, suspicion would always fall onto the Chechens. Clearly, the Chechens are behind this. 2000 was the first year of Putin, and most folks were convinced that there were at least 7 more to come. The disproportionate development of electoral technologies and political consciousness in Russia overturned any and all ideas about how much time is required to recognize the nation's father, with the people being unaware of Putin as late as 6 months before the start of this new era. Voters were choosing not with their heads, with the president's only promise being to establish order, nor with their hearts even, based on a candidate's charisma and heroic image. This no-nonsense character was a shorter gentleman whose unremarkable appearance could be described as blonde-haired dimwit. He was Russia's idol going into the 3rd millennium. It was likely prepared in advance, though it gave you the impression that it slipped out in fervor, but it was this phrase that laid the foundation for Putin's image as a man of his word. "Excuse me, but if we catch them in the toilet, we'll wipe them out in the outhouse. End of story." In folklore, the phrase was whittled down to wiping them out in the outhouse. The sick and tired Yeltsin was succeeded by someone assertive and energetic. This was all akin to testing a VP-1 strategic missile in 3 environments. On Earth, with Putin riding a train from Orekhovo-Zuyevo, underwater in a submarine, and in the air en route to Chechnya in an Su-27 fighter. The headline went, "Putin comes in wearing a helmet." The competition didn't stand a chance. Luzhkov and Primakov's party didn't dare lay claim to federal authority. It was obvious who would win the election, the only point of contention being whether there would be a second round. There never was. And even Yeltsin, in his final historical maneuver on New Year's Eve, made it clear that the decision was made, when we already have a strong person who is worthy of becoming president. With no other competition in sight, the new government contended with the old one, which involved visiting Tatar Sabantuy celebrations, where 4 years prior Yeltsin smashed a clay pot. Putin partook in a different exotic contest. He had to grab a coin with his mouth in a bowl of curdled milk. This trial in a 4th environment was covered by every TV station, and though the president passed it, his press office made sure they didn't film his face until it was clean, though there are a few photographs out there. Repeating those heroics involves finding the right spot, taking a bowl that's not too deep, filling it with kefir, then you toss in a coin, put a white robe on backwards, and dive in. There we are. In terms of political technologies, this is called soaking in the kefir. But none of his antics in various environments, none of his feats in the dojo were comparable to his administrative aptitude. Russia was already the world's most presidential republic, but Yeltsin did have to mind the stubborn Council of the Federation, the defiant State Duma, and rogue local authorities. Now the council was totally reformed, the State Duma was mostly pro-Kremlin, and the president could fire governors if they broke the law, so virtually in any case, and they were being overseen by presidential envoys, 5 out of 7 of them being generals. Finally, there was the main internal policy concept of the time, reinforcing the vertical of power. I intend to continue conducting this line of policy as we are conducting it currently. Thank you for your attention. Never before in history had there been such expensive pairs of crafty feet. After the 2000 European Soccer Championship, Real Madrid spent $56 million to hire Luis Figo from Portugal, while Lazio Rome FC bought the Argentinian Crespo for $54 million. Such investments usually pay off. Results tend to improve, more people come to see the game, TV broadcasting rights bring in more profit, and clubs sell more merch. Soccer is the #1 spectacle in the world. And the aforementioned players weren't even the best of their time. That honor goes to Frenchman Zidane and Brazilian Rivaldo, who Barcelona was refusing to let go for even $80 million. On August 27, 2000, which was a Sunday, 16 million TV screens all around Moscow and Moscow province went blank. It took a full day to put out the fire at the Ostankino TV tower, 2 more days to set up a temporary transmitter, which meant that for 3 days Moscow wasn't showing or telling. A short circuit occurred about 1,500 feet above the ground, and a bundle of wires caught fire. There was no automatic fire suppression system. 1,400 tourists had to make it out by foot. Casualties included a firefighter, an elevator operator, and a repairman. The transmitters and antennae survived. Only the feeders were damaged, the corrugated tubes that relay the signal upwards. Now the fire was descending together with drops of melted tube sheathing. The fire caused $60 million worth of damage. Some were even afraid that the tower might fall. During those 3 days, people completely emptied videocassette stores and rental shops. Online news portals were overwhelmed by the amount of traffic. The Ministry of Emergency Situations warned that the infrastructure in our country was neglected and worn out, and that this wouldn't be the last such incident. Finally, fans of Akhmatova no longer had to be shy to repeat her words. It's lovely to spend the evening with a detective novel. The iconic magazine Novy Mir starts publishing B. Akunin, who at the Moscow International Book Fair was named Author of the Year. His tales about Detective Erest Fandorin were fiction you didn't have to be ashamed of reading. These books were interesting, easy to read, featured playful yet accessible language. Detective novels were no longer just for reading in the subway. The main excuse for intellectuals would have been the author's roots. But behind the famous anarchist's last name with the initial B was Grigory Chkhartishvili, deputy chief editor of Foreign Literature magazine. He did later leave the magazine, with Akunin's popularity surpassing that of foreign literature. Also, the lighthearted genre was simply more interesting, which everybody was aware of, though they'd never admit it. I attribute various thoughts to my characters, which I don't necessarily agree with, but I do try to avoid having them say nonsense. That'd make for a boring read. In the summer and fall of 2000, people were suffering from mushroom poisoning far more often than usual, mostly after eating death caps. 97 people died in total in Russia, out of which 44 were from Voronezh province. Entire families were being hospitalized. Those were hard times. People were living off the land. Folks with zero experience were heading into the woods, who knew not of the golden rule to only pick up familiar mushrooms. Rumors about mutant mushrooms were never confirmed, with negligence being the main cause of these deaths. Patients are coming in when it's too late, and the toxins have already done too much damage for treatments to work, and there's nothing we can do to save them. In the time of Yeltsin, Vladimir Vishnevsky wrote a poem. Back then I was but a young lad who would prefer to be breastfed. When Berezovsky and Gusinsky Christianized the Russian land, these equal to apostles would the Lord himself be able to fund. These two famous oligarchs, despite having plenty of enemies, were still considered pillars of the system and an integral part of Russian capitalism. The year 2000 introduced dramatic change into how the government interacted with top-level businessmen. The equal to apostles oligarchs were more often in conflict than coming to terms. But in 2000, for the first time, they were united in their misfortune. Russian public television, which was under Berezovsky's control, was geared towards securing victory for the new government, and especially undermining the competition. The entire country witnessed how Sergei Dorenko thwarted Yuri Lushkov, who was literally knocking on the Kremlin's door, while Unity was aggressively moving towards becoming the reigning party. Berezovsky joined the opposition soon after the election, but this new perspective wouldn't be tolerated, and the media tycoon would soon lose control over his network. Good luck. Immediately, Berezovsky's multiple business endeavors fell under scrutiny, and so he decided it would be best for him to stay in exile. Vladimir Gusinsky's medium most had a falling out with the Kremlin even before that. Authorities didn't move in right away, but the spring brought with it searches, confiscations, multiple criminal charges, settlements, retractions, warrants, and prison sentences in Moscow and Madrid. In the old days, this would have been considered one hell of a biography. Gusinsky is being held in custody as a preventative measure. The further the pressure escalated, the more obvious it became that this wasn't really about taxes, loans, or assets. The better-known scandals in the public domain aside, they also came for almost every well-known businessman, even if he wasn't involved in politics. A telling moment was when the Prosecutor General's office offered Vladimir Potanin to pay an extra $140 million for Nornickel, in exchange for guarantees of not being prosecuted. He refused, though he did return Svyaz Invest stock to the government that he bought for way more. Apparently, this is all in the interest of the state. The privatization orchestrated by Yeltsin, Chubais, and Gaidar, that entire period of early capitalism now appeared to be a sort of NEP, a temporary concession to class enemies, who were actually friends. The president held a meeting where he gave Russian businessmen a stern warning not to shift responsibility, as they had made the country into what it was. Even the equal to apostle oligarchs had to admit that they had gotten a taste of their own medicine. I'd say it was a mistake. A tragic mistake made in 1996. Yeltsin was pretending it wasn't there, while Putin is pretending it is. Turns out revolutions don't just consume their offspring, but also their parents.
While the hunters were loading their rifles,
The year 2000 was when Europe's most notorious regime fell, with Slobodan Milošević losing the election. There was some commotion when he was stepping down, but nobody died, and people began to doubt whether the president of Yugoslavia was even the biggest monster on the continent. That election, which was considered to be rigged in and outside the country, saw Milošević losing in the very first round to oppositional candidate Vojislav Koštunica, a 56-year-old professor of philosophy. Yugoslavia's electoral committee had to pause to deal with the issue. They of course had to admit who won, but a few slight corrections put Koštunica's result at about 49%, Milošević's at 38.5%, which meant there would be a second round. The opposition maintained that over 52% voted for Koštunica, who refused to go to round 2 and called for a general strike. The West supported Koštunica while Moscow decided to wait. Koštunica was declared president at a demonstration in Belgrade, where 500,000 people who were friendly with the police took over the parliament and the TV center. The new president was now recognized by Moscow, the West, and even by Slobodan Milošević. On August 12, 2000, the Russian Navy's flagship K-141 Kursk submarine goes down with 118 people on board during a training exercise in the Barents Sea. The name of a major black soil region town was now associated with the most horrible tragedy in peacetime naval history. The main question, was every possible measure taken to save as many lives as possible, remained open and might forever. On the morning of August 12th, the Norwegian Seismic Array Service detected the explosions on Kursk. The submarine was found on Sunday morning, lying on the seabed 350 feet deep. 15 years had passed since Chernobyl, and authorities were still just as deceptive when it came to catastrophes. On Sunday, they reported that the exercise had ended successfully, On Monday, they admitted to technical difficulties. Allegedly, water had leaked into the front dome. But the crew was in touch, and the issue was being tended to. Until the very end of August, the people were counting the days since the incident and guessing how long until the oxygen supply would be depleted, which at first was said to be good for 6 days. Russia refused foreign assistance, and for the first few days, Russia's own divers were trying unsuccessfully to access the vessel. Some naval commanders were saying that the crew was immediately killed, others that there was 13 days worth of oxygen left. The crew list was classified, but it was revealed by journalists who bought it for $620. On day 9 after the incident, the hatch on Kursk was opened by Norwegian divers. The vessel was flooded, everyone was dead. On day 10, President Putin cancelled his vacation in Sochi and paid the crew members' families a visit. As of yesterday, to soften the audience's animosity, the head of state himself had to admit to being a victim. In Putin's own words, the country didn't have squat. He himself would have questioned the previous 10 years if he were a member of the audience. But then even these revelations only got out because someone had secretly recorded them. For the first time in 14 years, the country was entrusted with the World Hockey Championship, which was set to take place in St. Petersburg instead of Moscow this time, where they'd even built a hockey arena for the occasion. Pretty much every Russian NHL star made it over to represent their country, and it seemed as if we were moving towards a triumphant moment for the Russian school of hockey. After decimating the French team in the first game, Russia's team started losing to the US, Switzerland, Latvia, Belarus. We've all heard of the American basketball dream team. Well, this was a flop team that didn't even make it to the quarterfinals. We only managed to secure 11th place, which was our worst result ever. The national team and its captain Bure were being called national hockey frauds and accused of violating protocol and getting drunk at nightclubs. People were mad at the press, at head coach Yakushev for being too soft, and about the excess that was the hockey arena, located on the remote Bolshevikov prospect. They even tried to sell the name of this hockey arena on the city's outskirts, for $10, then for $8 million. The plan was to call it Balticum. Sports fans love beer, so the name would have worked, but the brewery pulled out. The total cost of this arena of disappointment was $84 million. And the investment wouldn't have paid off anytime soon, with there being plenty of other permanently half-empty venues in St. Petersburg. Remodeling 2 already existing facilities for the championship would have very much sufficed. But the Czech national team wasn't the only winner of that championship. On the final day, Vladimir Yakovlev was elected for a second term as governor of St. Petersburg, having in the finest traditions brought sports and politics together. The many people who disliked Yakovlev assumed that this was all about him being re-elected from the get-go, and that after a while, in typical Russian fashion, they'd open a flea market in the arena that would apparently be the largest one in the world. Russia was being invaded by Tatar and Bashkir music. 2 girls with Eastern names and Western-flavored melodies, Alsu and Zemfira, were the country's 2 main pop music stars, suffocating from the freshness pertained to both of them, but in different ways. They were already blowing up in '99. Then in 2000, Alsu earned Russia its best ever result at Eurovision, to then be recognized as an honored artist of Tataria during her illustrious state-level 17th birthday reception. After completing her second album, Zemfira gave her first ever solo concert in Moscow, which at least sparked some speculation about the era of Pugacheva coming to an end. The success of Bugulma native and London resident Alsu Tenisheva people liked to attribute to her dad, who was vice president of a big oil company. Alsu actually earned that second place at Eurovision on her own merit. Russian oil dollars won't buy you the love of Western viewers. Her song Solo was also the best-selling single in the entire 10-year history of Russian showbiz. The modest A student and her slow dance melodies was our response to the obnoxious foreign starlets. Zemfira Ramazanova from Ufa took the music scene by storm. She herself was the guitar player, writer, and singer of songs where Nabokov would become Nabokov, and with bombshell confessions like "But you have AIDS, which means that we will die." She was a controversial character with powerful voice, character, and sensuality. All of Russia's youth sang after her. I remember all of your flaws. Well, because if you record the actual blood, sweat, and tears of Ufa in a British studio while adhering to their strict recording standards, then the thunder will roll from Moscow to the country's furthest reaches.
Today, the last fruit fly perished.